Millionaire marries an unattractive woman as a joke, and is awestruck when this happened. Before diving into the story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Enjoy the story. Alexander Pierce stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, gazing down at the bustling city 40 stories below. At 34, he had everything society claimed should make him happy: a billion-dollar tech empire, multiple homes across the globe, and a face that regularly graced business magazines' most eligible bachelor lists. Yet as he watched his employees stream out of the building like ants, an all-too-familiar emptiness gnawed at him. His phone buzzed, another message from his mother. "Darling, the Hendersons' daughter is in town. She's just finished her MBA at Harvard and I thought perhaps." He deleted it without finishing. These attempts at matchmaking had become increasingly frequent since his younger sister's wedding last month. The truth was, Alexander had grown cynical about love. In his world, every relationship seemed to come with an agenda, every smile calculated to gain something. His last 3 girlfriends had all been models or socialites, each relationship ending when he discovered they were more interested in his Forbes ranking than his person. Taking a sip of his whiskey, he recalled the conversation that had sparked this particular bout of brooding. Earlier that day, his best friend and CFO, Marcus Chin, had challenged him during their weekly lunch. "You're becoming exactly what you always hated, Alex," Marcus had said, pushing aside his plate. "Remember when we started the company? You wanted to change the world, not just accumulate wealth. Now look at you, dating Instagram models and treating relationships like business transactions. That's rich coming from you," Alexander had retorted. "Didn't you marry your college sweetheart? The girl next door type? Not everyone gets that lucky." Marcus had given him a long look. "Lucky? I married Sarah because I saw her heart, not her social media following. When was the last time you even talked to a woman who wasn't perfectly polished and camera-ready?" The words had stung because they contained more truth than Alexander cared to admit. His world had become increasingly superficial, an endless parade of beautiful people with beautiful veneers hiding beautiful lies. He took another sip of whiskey, letting the amber liquid burn away the uncomfortable self-reflection. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Pierce? The new IT department head is here for her introduction meeting." His assistant's voice was apologetic. He'd completely forgotten about this appointment. "Send her in," he called out, not bothering to turn from the window. He heard the door open and close, followed by footsteps that were surprisingly quiet despite the hardwood flooring. When he finally turned, the glass nearly slipped from his hand. The woman standing before his desk was the antithesis of everything in his carefully curated world. Her ill-fitting brown suit looked at least a decade out of style, her mousy hair was pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing for her plain features, and she wore no makeup to soften her sharp nose or disguise the acne scars on her cheeks. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard, clear, intelligent, and utterly unimpressed by his designer suit or the opulent office. "Rebecca Winters," she said simply, extending her hand. "Your board hired me last week based on my work restructuring IBM's cloud security protocols." Her voice was surprisingly melodious, contrasting with her stark appearance. And in that moment, as Alexander reflexively shook her hand, a terrible idea began to form in his mind. What better way to prove Marcus wrong, or perhaps right, than to date someone who was the complete opposite of his usual type? The ultimate social experiment. It would be like a modern My Fair Lady, except he had no idea that this casual cruelty, this whim born of wounded pride and whiskey, would end up changing his life forever. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. The meeting with Rebecca lasted precisely 45 minutes, during which she methodically outlined her plans to overhaul the company's cybersecurity infrastructure. Alexander found himself oddly fascinated. While his other department heads often sugar-coated their presentations with flattery and corporate buzzwords, Rebecca spoke with refreshing directness. She didn't once smile or attempt to charm him, instead letting her expertise speak for itself. "Your current systems have at least 7 major vulnerabilities," she explained, pulling up detailed diagrams on her tablet. "If you've been targeted by any competent black hat hackers in the past year, they could have accessed everything." Her bluntness should have irritated him. He'd built much of the original security architecture himself, but instead he found himself leaning forward, engaged. As she packed up her materials to leave, Alexander made his decision. "Miss Winters," he called out just as she reached the door. Would you join me for dinner this evening? To discuss the implementation timeline in more detail. The slight pause in her step was the only indication that she'd registered anything unusual about this request. She turned back, those disconcertingly direct eyes studying him. Mr. Pierce, I've already provided a detailed timeline in the documentation. Unless you have specific concerns, I don't see the need for additional discussion outside of office hours. Her rejection, polite but firm, only strengthened his resolve. When was the last time anyone had said no to him? I insist, he said, flashing the smile that usually got him whatever he wanted. 7 o'clock, Le Bernardin. My assistant will send you the details. Rebecca adjusted her glasses, a gesture he would come to know well. I have plans this evening. However, if you'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting, we can do so during regular business hours. With that, she left, closing the door quietly behind her. Alexander sat back, both amused and slightly stunned. In his world of yes-men and social climbers, her complete indifference to his wealth and status was almost exotic. He pressed the intercom. Janet, get me everything you can find on Rebecca Winters. A few minutes later, his email pinged. The dossier was fascinating in its ordinariness. Grew up in a small town in Minnesota, daughter of a high school teacher and a librarian. Full scholarship to MIT, followed by a brilliant but decidedly unglamorous career in cybersecurity. No social media presence except a bare-bones LinkedIn profile. Her references were impeccable, her achievements impressive, but there wasn't a single photo of her at any industry events or parties. Alexander pulled up his phone and texted Marcus, "Dinner tonight? Need to run something by you." They met at their usual steakhouse, a private club where the waiters knew never to interrupt Alexander's conversations. After their drinks arrived, he laid out his plan. "I'm going to ask out the new IT head." Marcus nearly choked on his bourbon. "Rebecca Winters? I was in on her interviews. Brilliant woman, but..." He trailed off diplomatically. "But not my usual type," Alexander finished. "Exactly. You said I needed to look beyond the surface, see people's hearts. Well, here's my chance to prove I can do exactly that." He sat back, pleased with his logic. Marcus set down his glass carefully. "Let me get this straight. You want to ask out an accomplished professional woman who's responsible for a crucial part of your company's infrastructure, as some sort of social experiment." "Not an experiment," Alexander protested. "Call it expanding my horizons. Besides, you're the one who said I needed to change. I meant become less superficial, not play with someone's feelings to prove a point." Marcus's disapproval was evident. "This is a terrible idea, Alex. Professionally unethical, personally cruel, and likely to blow up in your face." Alexander waved away his concerns. "You're overthinking it. One dinner, maybe a few dates. If nothing else, it'll be a change of pace from the usual gold diggers and influencers. What's the worst that could happen?" Marcus just shook his head, but Alexander barely noticed. He was already planning his next move, his mind treating this as just another business challenge to be conquered. He had no idea that Rebecca Winters was about to teach him the difference between winning and growing, or that his casual game was about to become the most real thing in his life. Over the next week, Alexander found himself increasingly preoccupied with Operation Rebecca, as he'd begun calling it in his head. His usual tactics, sending expensive gifts, making grand gestures, leveraging mutual connections, all seemed oddly inappropriate. Rebecca Winters wasn't the type to be impressed by a surprise delivery of rare orchids or a last-minute invitation to Paris on his private jet. In fact, she seemed to barely acknowledge his existence beyond their necessary professional interactions. During their second project meeting, he watched her lead a team presentation with quiet authority. While his other executives often peppered their speeches with jokes and flattery directed at him, Rebecca focused entirely on substance. She had a way of breaking down complex technical concepts that made everyone in the room feel simultaneously educated and challenged. When one of the board members interrupted her with a condescending question, she calmly dismantled his assumptions with such precise logic that the man actually apologized. "Your security team needs a complete overhaul," she said after the others had left. "Half of them are relying on outdated protocols, and the other half are more concerned with office politics than actual security." She handed him a folder containing detailed performance reviews and restructuring recommendations. Alexander saw his opportunity. "We should discuss this over coffee," he suggested, giving her his most charming smile. "There's a great little place around the corner." Rebecca's expression didn't change. "These recommendations are time-sensitive, Mr. Pierce. If you'd like to schedule a proper meeting to review them, I have an opening tomorrow at 2 p.m. "Call me Alexander," he said, trying a different approach. "And I was thinking of something more informal. Sometimes the best solutions come from relaxed conversations." She adjusted her glasses again, a gesture he was beginning to interpret as mild irritation. "Mr. Pierce, I've worked in tech for 15 years. I'm well aware of how many informal conversations turn into attempts at workplace harassment lawsuits. I'll keep our interactions professional, and I suggest you do the same." The accusation stung, especially because it wasn't entirely unfair. How many of his past relationships had started exactly that way? A business meeting that turned into drinks, drinks that turned into dinner, dinner that turned into... But this was different, wasn't it? That evening, unable to focus on work, he found himself Googling her old company, finding a grainy photo from a tech conference 6 years ago. Rebecca stood in the background of a group shot, younger but with the same serious expression. According to the caption, she just won an award for innovative security protocols, but she looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. His phone buzzed, another text from his mother about another perfect society match. This time, he found himself staring at the attached photo of the gorgeous debutante with a strange feeling of emptiness. He'd dated dozens of women who looked exactly like that, and he could already predict every single conversation they'd have. The next morning, he arrived at the office early, planning to catch Rebecca before her team meeting. But when he stepped out of the elevator, he heard something unexpected: laughter. Following the sound, he found himself outside the IT department break room. Through the partially open door, he could see Rebecca surrounded by her team, demonstrating something on a whiteboard. Gone was the stern taskmaster from the board meeting. Her face was animated as she sketched out what appeared to be a complex diagram, her usually severe bun slightly loosened, wisps of hair framing her face as she gestured enthusiastically. "So you see, if we approach it this way," she was saying, "we can actually turn the firewall's limitations into an advantage." Her team was leaning forward, totally engaged, occasionally interrupting with questions that made her eyes light up. One junior developer made a joke about coding syntax, and Rebecca's laugh, genuine, unguarded, musical, made Alexander forget what he'd come to say. He stood there for a moment, watching unseen, and felt something shift in his perspective. This wasn't the carefully curated performance he was used to from his executives. This was someone in their element, surrounded by people who valued their shared passion more than politics or appearances. When was the last time he'd felt that pure enthusiasm for anything? His phone buzzed again, his mother, of course, pressing for an answer about the debutante. Looking through the doorway at Rebecca's animated expression, Alexander made a decision. He'd been going about this all wrong. If he wanted to understand this woman, he needed to enter her world, not drag her into his. Alexander spent the next few days doing something he hadn't done in years: research. Not the cursory background checks he usually ran on potential business associates, but deep, genuine study. He found himself falling down rabbit holes of cybersecurity forums, reading academic papers on encryption protocols, and watching recorded lectures from tech conferences where Rebecca had spoken. The more he learned, the more he realized how superficial his understanding of his own company's technology had become. He'd started Pierce Technologies as a true innovator, coding alongside his early team members late into the night. But somewhere along the way, he delegated the technical work to others, focusing instead on being the charming face of the company. When had he stopped being a creator and become just another suit? During the next security implementation meeting, he surprised everyone by asking detailed technical questions. Rebecca's eyebrow raised slightly when he referenced one of her published papers on quantum encryption protocols. He saw a flash of something in her eyes, not quite approval but perhaps reassessment. After the meeting, she lingered behind. "That was an interesting question about the quantum key distribution," she said, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "Though if you'd read the full paper, you'd know I addressed that concern in the methodology section." Alexander felt his face warm slightly. "I'll admit I didn't understand all of it," he said, and for once didn't try to mask his shortcomings with charm. "Would you be willing to explain it to me? The quantum mechanics aspects are a bit rusty since my MIT days." "You went to MIT?" Rebecca asked, and he noticed she was actually looking at him with interest for the first time. "Computer science and business, class of 12, he replied. "Though clearly I've let the technical side slide. These days I probably couldn't code my way out of a paper bag." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "That's not uncommon in tech leadership. They climb the ladder and forget what it's like in the trenches." She paused, seeming to debate something internally. "I'm running a workshop for the development team on quantum encryption basics tomorrow at lunch. You're welcome to sit in if you're genuinely interested." "I'd like that," Alexander said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. The workshop was held in one of the smaller conference rooms, not his usual luxurious boardroom. He slipped in quietly and took a seat at the back, watching as Rebecca walked her team through complex concepts with remarkable clarity. She traded her usual brown suit for black slacks and a simple blue blouse, and seemed more relaxed in this environment. "Mr. Pierce," she called out suddenly, making him sit up straighter. "Since you're here, would you like to help demonstrate the practical application?" Before he could respond, she was sketching a problem on the whiteboard. "Let's say you're trying to establish a secure communication channel." For the next hour, Alexander found himself fully engaged in the kind of technical challenge he hadn't tackled in years. Rebecca was a patient but demanding teacher, pushing him to think beyond surface-level solutions. When he finally cracked the problem, the triumph he felt was more satisfying than any recent business deal. As the team filed out after the workshop, he noticed something else: the way Rebecca's employees clearly respected and even admired her, not out of fear or obligation but because she invested in their growth. It was a different kind of leadership than his usual top-down approach. "You did better than I expected," she said as she gathered her materials. "Though your solution was a bit unconventional. Is that a diplomatic way of saying I made it unnecessarily complicated?" he asked, helping her stack the chairs. "Actually, it was elegant, just not in the way most security professionals would approach it." She gave him another one of those evaluating looks. "You still think like a programmer under all those expensive suits?" It wasn't exactly a compliment, but Alexander felt oddly pleased. For the first time in years, someone was seeing past his carefully crafted image to something more real. The irony that it was happening with the woman he'd initially pursued as a social experiment wasn't lost on him. As he walked back to his office, he realized he hadn't once thought about his original plan during the entire workshop. He'd been too busy actually learning, actually engaging, actually enjoying himself. The revelation was both unsettling and strangely liberating. Over the next few weeks, Alexander found himself spending more and more time in the IT department. He told himself it was just to stay updated on the security implementation, but he knew he was lying. There was something addictive about the atmosphere there, the intense problem-solving sessions, the genuine camaraderie, the way success was measured by results rather than appearances. Rebecca had started treating him with what he thought might be cautious respect. She'd taken to leaving technical articles on his desk, usually with specific sections highlighted and notes in the margins that said things like, "Your quantum solution made me think of this," or "Curious about your perspective on this approach." He found himself looking forward to these small exchanges more than any of the high society events that filled his calendar. One evening, working late, he wandered down to the IT floor and found Rebecca alone in the conference room, surrounded by empty coffee cups and technical diagrams. Her hair had completely escaped its usual bun, falling around her face in waves that softened her features. She'd rolled up her sleeves and kicked off her sensible shoes, and was muttering to herself as she scrawled equations on the whiteboard. "Problem?" he asked from the doorway. She didn't even look up. "There's an anomaly in the network traffic patterns. Could be nothing, could be the precursor to a sophisticated attack. I can't quite." She trailed off, frowning at her calculations. Without thinking, Alexander removed his suit jacket and rolled up his own sleeves. "Walk me through it?" For the next 3 hours they worked side by side, breaking down the problem from every angle. Rebecca challenged his rusty coding skills, while he contributed unexpected insights from his business perspective. They ordered terrible Chinese food and ate it straight from the containers while debating encryption protocols. At one point, they both reached for the last egg roll, their hands brushing briefly. Rebecca pulled back as if shocked, and Alexander felt an unexpected jolt that had nothing to do with static electricity. "Look at this pattern," she said quickly, pointing to a sequence of numbers. "It's almost like a Fibonacci sequence," Alexander finished, leaning in to study the data. "But that's too deliberate to be random noise." "Exactly." Rebecca's eyes lit up. "Someone's using mathematical sequences to disguise their intrusion attempts. If we analyze the traffic looking for other mathematical patterns?" She grabbed a marker and started writing frantically. Alexander watched her work, struck by how beautiful enthusiasm could make a person. Her face was animated, her movements quick and precise, her mind racing ahead to solutions he could barely follow. This was what Marcus had meant about seeing someone's heart, he realized. In that moment, he couldn't remember what he'd ever found attractive about the polished, perfect women who populated his usual world. When they finally cracked the pattern and identified the potential security breach, Rebecca's triumphant smile was more radiant than any practiced photo shoot grin. She held up her hand for a high five, then seemed to remember herself and quickly lowered it. But Alexander had already caught her hand in his, completing the gesture. "We make a good team," he said softly, still holding her hand. Rebecca withdrew it slowly, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Yes, well, your historical knowledge of coding patterns proved unexpectedly useful." She began gathering her things, her movements suddenly awkward. "I should go. Early meeting tomorrow?" "Rebecca," Alexander called as she reached the door. "Thank you. For letting me help. For treating me like just another programmer." She paused, one hand on the doorframe. "You're not just another programmer, Mr. Pierce. You're my boss. And it would be best for both of us if we remembered that." But there was something in her voice, a slight tremor perhaps, that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. After she left, Alexander sat in the quiet conference room, surrounded by the remnants of their shared work. His phone was full of missed calls and messages, a charity gala he was supposed to attend, his mother asking about the debutante again, a fashion model he'd been casually dating asking about weekend plans. For the first time in his adult life, the glittering world he'd built seemed hollow compared to a few hours of genuine collaboration over cheap takeout. The headlines started appearing a week later. Tech billionaire Alexander Pierce's new pet project? Accompanied by grainy photos of him entering the IT department. Pierce Technology CEO slumming it? With unflattering shots of him carrying takeout containers. The worst was a particularly nasty piece speculating about why he was spending so much time with his plain Jane IT head instead of attending his usual society functions. Marcus dropped the latest tabloid on his desk. "This is exactly what I was worried about," he said. "The media's turning it into a circus, and Rebecca's caught in the crossfire." Alexander pushed the paper away in disgust. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm learning about my own company's security infrastructure." "Since when is that tabloid fodder?" "Since you started spending every evening in the IT department instead of attending board members' parties," Marcus replied. "People are talking, Alex. The old guard doesn't like that you're skipping their events to eat Chinese food with the help." "Don't call her that," Alexander snapped, with more heat than he'd intended. "Rebecca's probably smarter than our entire board combined." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And when did she become Rebeccan instead of Miss Winters?" "Look, I'm glad you're taking an interest in the technical side again, but be careful. If this goes wrong, she's the one who'll suffer for it. Her reputation is based on 15 years of brilliant work, not on who she does or doesn't have dinner with," Alexander interrupted. But he knew Marcus had a point. The whispers were already starting, the same toxic gossip that had driven away other talented employees who didn't fit the company's glossy image. That afternoon he found himself standing in Rebecca's office doorway. She was reading something on her computer screen, her expression carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "About the papers." "I don't read tabloids," she replied without looking up. But her hands were gripping her desk too tightly. "Still, you shouldn't have to deal with this. I'll stop coming down here so much. Go back to my usual schedule." That made her look up. "Is that what you want? To go back to being the glamorous CEO who only talks to his IT department through 3 layers of management?" "No," he admitted. "But I don't want to damage your reputation either." Rebecca stood up slowly. "Mr. Pierce, do you know why I took this job?" When he shook his head, she continued. "Because Pierce Technologies, despite its recent focus on image over innovation, still has the potential to revolutionize cybersecurity. I came here to do important work, not to worry about what tabloids think of my lunch choices." She walked around her desk, facing him directly. "If you're backing off because you've lost interest in the technical work, fine. But if you're doing it because of what some gossip columnist wrote?" She shrugged. "Well, then you're not the scientist I thought was still hiding under those designer suits." Alexander stared at her, struck by the quiet challenge in her voice. She wasn't playing games or trying to manipulate him, she was simply stating her truth, as direct and uncompromising as ever. "There's a bug in the new firewall protocol," he said finally. "I noticed it last night but didn't get a chance to tell you. Want to take a look?" The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Conference room. I'll bring the markers if you get the coffee." As they walked to their usual working space, Alexander was acutely aware of the stares and whispers from other employees. But when Rebecca started breaking down the problem on the whiteboard, everything else faded away. This was real, the complex puzzles, the intellectual challenge, the satisfaction of finding solutions. He'd forgotten how much he loved this part of his work, before shareholders and society pages had taken over his life. Looking at Rebecca's focused expression as she debugged his code, he realized something else. His original plan to date her as some sort of social experiment seemed not just cruel now but absurd. She wasn't a project or a statement. She was brilliant and principled and utterly herself. And somehow, without meaning to, he'd started caring about her opinion more than all the society columnists combined. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. The annual Pierce Technologies Charity Gala was approaching, and Alexander found himself dreading it for the first time in years. Usually, these events were his element: champagne flowing, photographers flashing, beautiful people making deals between dances. But now, the thought of all that artificial glamour made him feel oddly claustrophobic. "You have to attend," his PR director insisted during their morning meeting. "After all these rumors, you need to be seen in your usual circles. We've arranged for Victoria Chin to be your date. She's just landed the cover of Vogue, and her father's firm is considering a major investment." "No," Alexander interrupted, surprising himself as much as his PR team. "I'm not playing that game anymore. The gala should be about raising money for children's education and technology, not about who I'm dating." His PR director looked pained. "At least let us seat you with the venture capital group. There's a lovely analyst who—" "Actually," Alexander said, "an idea forming. I want the seating chart restructured. Less emphasis on net worth, more on technological innovation. And I want our development teams represented at every table." That evening, he made his way to Rebecca's office, finding her deep in conversation with a junior developer. She was walking the younger woman through a complex piece of code, her patience evident in every careful explanation. Alexander waited until the developer left, beaming with new understanding before knocking on the door frame. "The charity gala next week," he said without preamble. "I'd like you to attend. To discuss our quantum encryption progress with potential investors." He quickly added, "The whole IT leadership team will be there. It's time we put the focus back on innovation." Rebecca studied him for a long moment. "Is this a professional invitation?" "Completely," he assured her, ignoring the way his heart had started beating faster. "Though, I can't guarantee the tabloids will see it that way." "The tabloids can write whatever they want," she said, turning back to her computer. "I'll attend if you can guarantee one thing: that I won't be seated next to some venture capitalist's son as part of a matchmaking scheme." Alexander couldn't help smiling. "No matchmaking schemes. You'll be at the innovation showcase table, terrorizing billionaires with discussions of post-quantum cryptography." "In that case," she said, the corner of her mouth twitching slightly, "I accept." The night of the gala arrived, and Alexander found himself anxiously checking the entrance more often than he'd like to admit. When Rebecca finally appeared, he nearly dropped his champagne glass. She hadn't tried to transform herself into someone else. There were no dramatic makeover clichés here. She wore a simple dark blue dress that fit her perfectly, her hair swept back in a softer version of her usual style, minimal makeup highlighting her clear eyes. She looked comfortable in her own skin, elegant without pretense. To his surprise, she quickly became the center of attention at her table. Investors and tech pioneers who usually spent these events networking over cocktails were leaning in, captivated by her passionate explanations of emerging security threats and potential solutions. She didn't flutter or flirt, she challenged, questioned, and inspired. "Your IT head is remarkable," a veteran venture capitalist told Alexander. "She just explained quantum computing risks to me so clearly that I'm doubling my investment in cybersecurity startups." Alexander watched as Rebecca sketched a diagram on a napkin, her hands animated as she talked about encryption protocols. A small crowd had gathered around her, including several young women in tech who seemed thrilled to see someone like her commanding such respect. "She is remarkable," he agreed softly, more to himself than anyone else. For the first time he saw his world through her eyes, the superficial connections, the transactional relationships, the emphasis on appearance over substance. He'd been so focused on trying to bring her into his world that he hadn't realized her world was far richer. Later, as the evening wound down, he found her on the terrace taking a break from the crowds. The city lights sparkled below them like stars, and a cool breeze carried the scent of the garden flowers. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for making it about the work." "It should always have been about the work," he replied. "I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and he felt more exposed than he had in years. Why did you really start coming to the IT department, Mr. Pierce? The question he'd been dreading. He could have lied, given her some polished answer about professional interest, but she deserved better. She taught him the value of authenticity, even when it was uncomfortable. I had an agenda at first, he admitted, watching her expression carefully. A stupid, shallow plan to prove something to myself and others. But then I got to know you, the real you, and everything changed. You changed me. The silence that followed Alexander's confession felt eternal. Rebecca's face went through a series of micro-expressions: shock, hurt, anger, and something else he couldn't quite read. Finally, she took a careful step back from him. An agenda, she repeated, her voice perfectly controlled. I see. And what exactly was this agenda, Mr. Pierce? To see if you could transform the plain IT director into someone worthy of your social circle? Or was it more about proving to yourself that you could be charitable enough to notice someone like me? No, that's not, Alexander started, but she held up a hand to stop him. Did you know that when I was hired, 3 different people warned me about you? Her words were precise, measured. They told me you had a reputation for turning the company into your personal playground. But I ignored them because I believed in the work we were doing. I thought I saw something genuine in your interest in the technical side. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. I actually started to respect you. Rebecca, please, Alexander stepped forward, but she backed away. What I started feeling, what I feel now, it's real. Is it? She met his eyes directly. Or am I just the most interesting experiment you've run lately? The awkward genius who taught the billionaire playboy to appreciate inner beauty? Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and that tiny show of emotion hit him harder than any angry outburst could have. You're right, he said quietly. I was shallow and stupid and completely wrong. But everything that happened after, the late nights solving problems, the technical discussions, seeing you with your team, that changed me. You changed me not because I was running some experiment, but because you showed me what real passion and integrity look like. That's a lovely speech, Rebecca said, wrapping her arms around herself despite the mild evening. Very romantic. I'm sure it's worked on plenty of women before. None, Alexander replied immediately. Because I've never told anyone else the complete truth before. I've never cared enough to risk it. She studied him for a long moment, and he forced himself to stand still under her scrutiny. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer but no less firm. I'm going to take a leave of absence. The security implementation is nearly complete, and my team can handle the rest. You don't have to. Yes, I do, she cut him off. Because right now, I don't know if I can trust my own judgment around you. I've spent my entire career being underestimated, being treated as either a threat or a curiosity by men in power. I promised myself I would never let anyone make me doubt my own worth. And yet here I am, wondering if every moment of connection we shared was just part of your experiment. Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach. What can I do? How can I prove to you that I've changed? Rebecca gathered her small clutch, her movements precise and controlled again. That's not my problem, Mr. Pierce. I didn't come to Pierce Technologies to be part of your journey of personal growth. I came to do important work. And right now, I need space to decide if I can continue doing that work here. She turned to leave, then paused. You know what the saddest part is? I actually believe you've changed. But that doesn't erase the fact that you were willing to play games with someone's feelings just to prove a point. Some breaches of trust can't be patched as easily as software vulnerabilities. With that, she walked away, her sensible heels clicking against the terrace tiles. Alexander watched her disappear into the crowded ballroom, fighting the urge to follow her. He'd never felt more alone in a room full of people who were supposedly his peers. His phone buzzed, another society gossip alert, probably about him and Rebecca at the gala. For the first time in his life, Alexander Pierce, the man who had carefully crafted every moment of his public image, didn't care what they were writing about him. He only cared about what he'd lost before he'd even fully understood its value. The IT department felt different without Rebecca. Everything was running smoothly, she trained her team too well for it to be otherwise, but the energy had changed. No more late-night problem-solving sessions, no more impromptu teaching moments, no more passionate debates about encryption protocols. Alexander found himself walking past her empty office several times a day, each time feeling the weight of his mistake more heavily. She's in Boston, Marcus told him over lunch, pushing away his barely touched salad. Consulting for MIT's cybersecurity department during her leave. How do you know that? Alexander asked, trying not to sound too eager for information. Unlike you, I never gave her a reason not to trust me, Marcus replied pointedly. We still email occasionally. She's doing important work there, Alex. Don't interfere unless you're absolutely sure you've got something worth saying. Alexander nodded slowly, pushing his own food around his plate. I've been thinking about the company. About what it's become under my leadership. And I think it's time for Pierce Technologies to remember what we started for. He pulled out his tablet, showing Marcus a series of documents. I've been working on this since she left. Marcus's eyes widened as he scrolled through the plans. Alex, this would be a complete restructuring. Prioritizing R&D over marketing? Establishing an education foundation? Partnering with universities for cybersecurity research? The board will fight you on this? Let them, Alexander said quietly. I've spent years being the face they wanted, the charming billionaire playboy who made tech sexy. But that's not why I started this company. Rebecca reminded me what it feels like to actually create something meaningful, to solve real problems. And this has nothing to do with trying to win her back? Alexander considered the question carefully. She taught me that actions matter more than intentions. Even if she never comes back, these changes need to happen. Pierce Technologies should be known for innovation, not for its CEO's social life. Over the next few weeks, Alexander threw himself into the restructuring. He spent hours with the development teams, relearning their challenges and needs. He established a scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in tech, with a special focus on cybersecurity. The tabloids still followed him, but now they were writing about his mysterious transformation from playboy to serious tech leader. He kept tabs on Rebecca's work through academic journals, reading her papers and following her contributions to the field. She was doing groundbreaking research at MIT, exactly as he'd expected. Sometimes, late at night, he'd find himself writing emails to her, long messages about his realizations, the changes he was making, how much he'd learned from her. He never sent them. Then came the day of the board meeting where he would present his complete restructuring plan. As he prepared his presentation, a notification popped up on his screen. A new paper had just been published in a major cybersecurity journal, co-authored by Rebecca Winters. The topic made his heart skip: ethical leadership and technical innovation, the responsibility of tech companies in shaping future security paradigms. He downloaded it immediately, and there in the introduction was a line that made him catch his breath. While profit-driven tech companies often prioritize image over innovation, there remains potential for genuine transformation when leadership reconnects with the fundamental purpose of technological advancement, solving real problems that affect real people. Alexander read the entire paper twice, recognizing hints of their late-night discussions in some of the points. She'd taken their conversations about the soul of tech companies and turned them into a framework for ethical innovation. Even away from Pierce Technologies, she was still teaching him. Walking into the board meeting, he felt a calm certainty he'd never experienced before. This wasn't about impressing anyone or maintaining an image. This wasn't even about Rebecca anymore, though she'd been the catalyst. This was about being the leader his company truly needed, the person he should have been all along. Gentlemen, he began, looking at the row of skeptical board members, it's time we had an honest conversation about the future of Pierce Technologies, and my role in shaping it. The board meeting lasted for 6 hours. Alexander presented every detail of his restructuring plan, defending each point with the kind of technical knowledge that reminded the older board members why they'd backed him in the first place. He showed them security breach statistics, research and development projections, and the growing market demand for genuine innovation over flashy marketing. This is more than a cosmetic change, he explained, pulling up slides that would have bored him to tears a few months ago. We're looking at a fundamental shift in how Pierce Technologies approaches its role in the industry. And what about our shareholders? Demanded Harrison Wells, one of the most conservative board members. They've grown accustomed to a certain image, certain profit margins. Our shareholders invested in a technology company, Alexander countered, not a PR firm. And if we don't make these changes now, we'll be left behind by companies that actually prioritize innovation. He brought up his next slide. Look at these numbers from our IT department's recent security overhaul. Under Rebecca Winters' leadership, we've seen a 70% improvement in threat prevention. Ah yes, Miss Winters, another board member interrupted with a knowing smirk. We've all seen the tabloids, Alexander. Is this restructuring really about the company's future, or is it about impressing one employee? Alexander felt a familiar flash of anger, but he controlled it. Rebecca had taught him the value of responding with facts over emotion. Miss Winters' departure has actually cost us significantly, he said calmly, showing them the metrics. Not just in terms of technical expertise, but in team productivity and innovation. The fact that we valued image over talent so much that we lost one of our most valuable contributors? That's exactly the problem I'm trying to fix. The debate continued, growing heated at times. Alexander stood his ground, answering every challenge with the kind of detailed technical knowledge he'd regained during those late nights working with Rebecca and her team. Finally, as evening fell over the city, the board called for a vote. 7 in favor, 5 against, Marcus announced, unable to keep the smile from his face. The restructuring plan passes. Alexander should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt something quieter, a sense of rightness, of finally steering the company back toward its original purpose. As the board members filed out, many still grumbling, he remained in his chair, looking at the last slide still projected on the wall. Returning to our roots, innovation with purpose? Congratulations, Marcus said, hanging back after the others had left. Though I notice you didn't mention your other plan. What other plan? Marcus raised an eyebrow. The education initiative? The one you've been working on secretly for weeks? Establishing free coding schools in underserved communities, partnering with libraries for tech literacy programs? Alexander shrugged, gathering his materials. That's not a corporate initiative. I'm funding it personally. The company's changes needed to stand on their own merits. You know, Marcus said thoughtfully, 2 months ago you would have made sure everyone knew about your charitable work. Would have posed for photos with disadvantaged kids learning to code, turned it into a PR goldmine. 2 months ago, I was an idiot, Alexander replied simply. Besides, this isn't about charity. It's about addressing a real need. Did you know most cybersecurity breaches exploit basic technological illiteracy? If we want a more secure digital future, we need to make sure everyone has access to fundamental tech education. Marcus smiled. You sound like Rebecca when you talk like that. I sound like myself, Alexander corrected him. The self I forgot about somewhere between our first startup days and making the Forbes cover. He paused, looking out at the city lights. She just reminded me who that person was. Have you told her about any of this? Alexander shook his head. She was right about needing space. And about the fact that this couldn't be about her. These changes needed to happen because they're right for the company, for our users, for the future of tech. Not as some grand gesture to win her back. And if she never comes back? Then Pierce Technologies will still be a better company because of what she taught us. And I'll be a better leader because of what she taught me. Alexander gathered his jacket, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the long day. The truth is, Marcus, even if I never see her again, I owe her a debt I can never repay. She showed me the difference between success and significance. As they walked out of the conference room, Alexander's phone buzzed with a news alert. The tech press was already reporting on Pierce Technologies' dramatic new direction. There would be challenges ahead, shareholders to convince, transitions to manage, a complete corporate culture to reshape. But for the first time in years, Alexander was looking forward to the hard work. He had finally found something more satisfying than being on magazine covers, actually making a difference in his field again. He just wished he could share it with the person who had made it all possible. 3 months into Pierce Technologies' restructuring, the changes were becoming visible. The marketing department's chrome and glass showcase floor had been converted into an open innovation lab where developers could collaborate on new projects. Alexander had moved his own office down to the technical floors, trading his expansive view for proximity to the actual work being done. The tabloids had finally grown bored of him, especially since he'd stopped attending society events in favor of tech conferences and coding workshops. One morning, as he was reviewing security protocols with Rebecca's former team, a junior developer raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Pierce? I found something in the code base you might want to see. Alexander rolled his chair over to her station, noticing how the team no longer tensed up when he approached. The developer, Sarah, he remembered, one of Rebecca's most promising protégés, pointed to a section of code. This encryption protocol, she explained, the one Miss Winters designed before she left? I think I found a way to make it even more efficient. It's based on something she taught me about quantum resistance, but with a different application. Alexander leaned in, studying the elegant solution. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking Rebecca had always encouraged. Walk me through it, he said, pulling up a chair. 2 hours later, they were still at it, the whole team gathered around Sarah's station, building on her initial insight. It reminded him so much of those late nights with Rebecca that his chest ached, but there was joy too in seeing her legacy living on in the team she'd built. That evening, as he was finally heading home, he ran into Marcus in the parking garage. His friend looked at him oddly. You've got ink on your face, Marcus said. And your suit is wrinkled. Alexander touched his cheek, finding marker residue from the impromptu whiteboard session. He hadn't even noticed. "Good day at work," he said simply. "I can see that." Marcus fell into step beside him. "The board's quarterly review is next week. The numbers are in. And you were right. Innovation is selling better than Image ever did. Our cybersecurity division's revenue is up 40%. 3 major tech companies have approached us about partnerships. And that coding school you started in the Bronx? The first class graduates next month?" Alexander nodded, feeling satisfied but not triumphant. Success meant something different to him now. "Have you heard from her?" Marcus hesitated. "She's been offered a permanent position at MIT, leading their new cybersecurity research center." The news hit harder than Alexander expected. He'd known, of course, that she might not come back, but the possibility becoming reality still hurt. "She deserves it," he said finally. "She'll do amazing things there." "She's also been reading about Pierce Technologies' changes," Marcus added carefully. "She asked me if they were real." Alexander stopped walking. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you've barely left the office in 3 months. That you're coding again, mentoring junior developers, actually leading instead of just being a figurehead. That half the board thinks you've lost your mind, but the employees have never been more engaged." Marcus gave him a long look. "I also told her about the education initiative you've been quietly funding. She was interested in that." "It doesn't matter," Alexander said, starting to walk again. "She was right about everything. I needed to make these changes because they were right, not to impress her or win her back. And if she's impressed anyway?" Alexander shook his head. "Then that's her choice to make. I've learned enough to know I can't control or manipulate other people's feelings. Even if they're feelings I desperately wish I hadn't damaged." He thought about the email he'd drafted to her last night, the one still sitting in his unsent folder. He'd wanted to tell her about Sarah's breakthrough, about how her teaching was still influencing the team, about all the ways the company was becoming what it should have been all along. But in the end, he'd saved it with all the others. Some things had to be proven through sustained action, not just words. "You know what the strangest part is?" he said as they reached their cars. "Even if she never comes back, I'm actually happy. Not the kind of happiness I used to think I wanted, the magazine covers and society parties and perfect arm candy dates. But real happiness from doing work that matters and helping other people grow." Marcus smiled. "Sounds like someone I know finally grew up." "No," Alexander corrected him. "Someone you know finally remembered who he was supposed to be all along." He got into his car, then rolled down the window. "Hey Marcus, thank you. For sticking with me through all of this. For telling me hard truths even when I didn't want to hear them." "That's what friends are for," Marcus replied. "Though I have to admit I prefer this version of you. The one who doesn't need to be told hard truths quite so often." As Alexander drove home, he passed one of the newsstands that used to prominently display his face. Now it was showing some other billionaire playboy's latest scandal. He didn't even slow down to look. He had code to review, security protocols to update, and a team counting on him to be more than just a pretty face on a magazine cover. It was real work, hard work, meaningful work. And for the first time in his adult life, that felt like more than enough. The MIT Cybersecurity Conference was the kind of event Alexander used to skip, sending lower-level executives to represent Pierce Technologies while he attended more glamorous functions. Now, seated in the auditorium among rows of technical experts, he felt more at home than he ever had at any charity gala. He hadn't known she would be speaking. The agenda had listed Dr. Arne Winters as part of a panel on emerging security threats, and he'd been too focused on his own presentation about corporate responsibility in tech to make the connection. But when Rebecca walked onto the stage, looking exactly as he remembered in a simple blazer and practical slacks, his carefully prepared notes suddenly seemed far away. She commanded the stage not with charm or charisma, but with pure expertise. Her presentation on quantum encryption vulnerabilities was brilliant, challenging, and occasionally even funny in a dry, technical way that made the audience of security experts chuckle appreciatively. Alexander found himself taking notes, not just because her insights were valuable, but because he could see 3 different ways Pierce Technologies could implement her suggestions. "The future of security isn't about building higher walls," she was saying, "but about creating smarter, more adaptive systems that can learn and evolve. And that requires a fundamental shift in how tech companies approach innovation." Alexander glanced down at his own presentation notes, smiling slightly. He'd written almost exactly the same thing, though her phrasing was better. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, he stayed silent, not wanting to disturb her moment. But he watched with quiet pride as Sarah, his junior developer who'd flown up with him, raised her hand and asked a technically brilliant question that made Rebecca's eyes light up with interest. After the panel, he deliberately lingered in the conference hall, giving Rebecca plenty of time to leave if she wanted to avoid him. His own presentation wasn't for another hour. But as he was reviewing his slides one last time, a familiar voice made him look up. "Your developer asked a good question," Rebecca said, standing a careful distance away. "Sarah, isn't it? She's grown a lot." "She has an excellent teacher," Alexander replied, then quickly added, "Had. The foundations you built with the team are still helping them grow." Rebecca nodded, her expression professional but not cold. "I've been reading about Pierce Technologies' changes. The education initiative is unexpected." "Good unexpected or bad unexpected?" "Just unexpected." She adjusted her glasses, a gesture so familiar it made his heart ache. "Marcus said it was your personal project, not a corporate PR stunt." "The kids deserve to learn without being props in someone's photo op," Alexander said simply. "We're opening 3 more schools next month. The first class is already getting internship offers." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Teaching teenagers to code, it's a long way from society galas and magazine covers. It's closer to who I always should have been." He met her eyes directly. "You taught me that." Among other things. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Rebecca shifted her weight slightly. "I should go. I have another panel." "Wait," Alexander said quickly. "I'm presenting later on corporate responsibility and technical innovation. I'd appreciate your feedback if you have time to attend." "Professional feedback," he clarified. "As someone who's been writing and thinking about these issues?" She studied him for a long moment, and he forced himself to stay still under her scrutiny. "I'll try to make it," she said finally. "I am curious about the direction Pierce Technologies is taking." "The direction it should have taken from the start," he corrected gently. "Sometimes we need someone to remind us of our original purpose." Rebecca's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Good luck with your presentation, Mr. Pierce." "Alexander," he said quietly. "After everything you can call me Alexander." She nodded once, then turned to leave. But at the last moment she glanced back. "Your tie is crooked," she said. "You always did get disheveled when you were focused on technical problems." Before he could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd of conference attendees. Alexander reached up to straighten his tie, realizing he probably looked more like a rumpled programmer than a billionaire CEO. Somehow that felt like progress. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. Alexander had given hundreds of presentations before, but never one that mattered quite this much. As he took the stage, he forced himself not to scan the audience for Rebecca. This wasn't about her, it was about the future of technology and corporate responsibility. That's what she taught him after all, to focus on the work itself, not the performance of it. "When I started Pierce Technologies," he began, "I was a programmer who wanted to solve real problems. Somewhere along the way I lost sight of that mission. I became more focused on being a tech celebrity than a tech innovator. And I'm not the only one, our entire industry has developed an unhealthy obsession with image over impact." He brought up his first slide, showing the declining rate of meaningful innovation in major tech companies compared to their increasing marketing budgets. The data was stark, honest, and potentially uncomfortable for many of the corporate representatives in the audience. "We've created a system where appearing innovative is more profitable than actually innovating," he continued. "Where we spend more on promoting our solutions than on finding real ones. Where we value style over substance, flash over functionality, and short-term profits over long-term progress." From the corner of his eye, he caught movement near the back of the hall. Rebecca had slipped in quietly, standing against the wall with her arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but she was listening intently. "But there's good news," Alexander said, clicking to his next slide. "The moment we realign our priorities with our original purpose, real innovation flourishes." He showed the data from Pierce Technologies' restructuring, the increased patent filings, the improved security metrics, the successful open-source initiatives. "We've discovered something surprising. When you prioritize genuine innovation and ethical development, profit follows naturally. Not because you're chasing it, but because you're creating actual value." He smiled slightly. "It turns out that substance is ultimately more profitable than style." "Who knew?" The audience chuckled, but Alexander kept his tone serious. However, we have a responsibility that goes beyond our bottom line. The digital divide isn't just an inconvenience, it's a security threat. When large portions of our population lack basic tech literacy, they become vulnerable to exploitation. That's why education has to be part of any serious tech company's mission. He brought up images from the coding schools, careful shots that focused on the work being done rather than using the students as props. These aren't charity projects. They're investments in our shared digital future. Every student who learns to code is another potential innovator, another problem solver, another person who might see solutions we've missed. As he moved into the technical portion of his presentation, detailing specific ways companies could restructure to prioritize innovation, he found himself using phrases and concepts he'd learned from Rebecca. Not copying her work, but building on the foundation of understanding she'd helped him develop. The challenge isn't technical, he concluded. We know how to build better systems, how to create more secure solutions, how to bridge the digital divide. The challenge is choosing to prioritize these real improvements over superficial ones. It's about deciding what kind of legacy we want to leave, Instagram-worthy photo ops, or actual change that improves people's lives. The applause was substantial, but Alexander barely noticed it. He was watching Rebecca's face, seeing something shift in her expression. For the first time since their confrontation at the gala, she was looking at him not with hurt or professional detachment, but with what might have been pride. After the Q&A session, Alexander found himself surrounded by other tech executives wanting to discuss implementation details. He answered their questions patiently, remembering how Rebecca always took time to explain technical concepts clearly. When he finally broke free, he looked for her in the crowd, but she was gone. Back in his hotel room that evening, he found an email waiting for him. The sender was r.winters@mit.edu, and the subject line read simply, "Your presentation." His hand hovered over the mouse, suddenly nervous. This wasn't part of his plan for redemption. He hadn't even known she would be there today. But maybe that was better. Maybe the most convincing changes are the ones we make when we think nobody's watching. Taking a deep breath, he clicked open the email, ready to face whatever judgment it contained. After all, he'd learned from the best that honest feedback, even when it hurts, is more valuable than comfortable lies. Alexander stared at the open email for a long moment, his cursor hovering over the text. Finally, he began to read. Mr. Pierce, Alexander. Your presentation today raised several important points about the intersection of corporate responsibility and technical innovation. Your analysis of the innovation-to-marketing ratio across major tech companies was particularly insightful. I've been researching similar metrics for my upcoming paper on industry transformation. I would be interested in learning more about your education initiative's curriculum, particularly how you're approaching cybersecurity education at the high school level. MIT is developing similar outreach programs, and there might be potential for collaboration. If you're amenable, I suggest we discuss this over coffee tomorrow morning. There's a decent place in the campus center that actually knows how to make a proper cappuccino. 9 a.m. if your schedule permits. Regards, Rebecca Winters, Ph.D. Director of Advanced Cybersecurity Research, MIT Technology Institute. Alexander read the email 3 times, noting every careful word choice. It was perfectly professional, focused entirely on work. But the fact that she was reaching out at all, that she remembered his coffee preference. He checked the time, 11:43 p.m. Too late to respond without seeming overeager. He set an alarm for 6 a.m., determined to craft the perfect reply. Sleep proved elusive. He found himself reviewing all the technical documentation about the education initiative, preparing answers for every possible question. Around 3 a.m., he realized he was acting like a student cramming for an exam, and smiled at himself in the dark hotel room. Rebecca had always had that effect on him, making him want to be better, no more, dig deeper. At exactly 6 a.m., he sent his reply. Dr. Winters, thank you for your interest in the education initiative. I would welcome the opportunity to discuss potential collaboration. 9 a.m. works perfectly. I look forward to sharing our curriculum details and learning more about MIT's outreach programs. Best regards, Alexander Pierce. He arrived at the campus center at 8:45, choosing a quiet table near the windows. The morning light filtered through autumn leaves, creating patterns on the worn wooden table. At precisely 9 a.m., Rebecca appeared, carrying a laptop bag and wearing a deep green sweater that made her eyes look more hazel than brown. You're early, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. You used to be chronically late to morning meetings? I learned the value of respecting other people's time, he replied quietly. The unspoken from Yug hung in the air between them. Rebecca opened her laptop. All business. Tell me about your cybersecurity curriculum. How are you making complex concepts accessible to high school students? For the next hour, they discussed educational strategies, potential partnerships, and the challenges of teaching tech literacy across different socioeconomic backgrounds. Alexander showed her the specialized learning modules his team had developed, and Rebecca offered invaluable suggestions for improvement. Their conversation flowed naturally, built on shared passion and expertise. Your approach to teaching encryption is innovative, Rebecca said, making notes on her laptop. The way you're using game design principles to demonstrate security concepts. It's very effective. I had a good teacher, Alexander replied. Someone who showed me how to make complex ideas accessible without oversimplifying them. Rebecca's fingers paused on her keyboard. For a moment, the professional facade cracked slightly. You've done good work here, Alexander. Real work. I learned that there's no shortcut to meaningful change, he said. Whether it's in security protocols or personal growth. She closed her laptop slowly, finally meeting his eyes directly. Why didn't you publicize the education initiative? It could have been excellent PR for Pierce Technologies, because then it would have been about image again, he answered honestly. These kids deserve better than to be props in someone's redemption story. Even mine. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those penetrating eyes that had always seen right through his carefully constructed facade. You've changed, she said finally. I had to, he replied simply. Once you understand what really matters, you can't go back to pretending the superficial stuff is enough. The morning light caught the subtle red highlights in her hair as she gathered her things. MIT's Outreach Program Committee meets next Thursday, she said. Would you be willing to present your curriculum to them? Purely professionally, of course. Of course, Alexander agreed, keeping his voice steady despite the hope blooming in his chest. I'll have my assistant send you the materials in advance. As they stood to leave, Rebecca paused. Your presentation yesterday, the part about substance over style. Did you mean it? Every word. She nodded slowly. Good. Because I'm still not interested in being anyone's transformation project or social experiment. But I am interested in doing meaningful work with people who share that commitment. That's all I'm asking for, Alexander said softly. A chance to prove that the change is real. Through actions, not words. Rebecca adjusted her laptop bag, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Thursday then. Don't be late. As she walked away, Alexander remained at the table, watching the autumn leaves dance in the morning light. For the first time since she'd left Pierce Technologies, he felt truly hopeful. Not because of any grand romantic gesture or dramatic reconciliation, but because they'd found common ground in the work itself. And maybe that was the most honest foundation they could build on. The week leading up to the MIT presentation felt different from any other in Alexander's life. He threw himself into preparation, but not with his old drive for perfection and control. Instead, he found himself genuinely excited about the possibility of expanding the education initiative's impact. Each evening, he and Rebecca exchanged emails about curriculum details and implementation strategies, their correspondence strictly professional but underlaid with a growing mutual respect. On Wednesday afternoon, his phone buzzed with an unexpected text from her. Students from your Bronx program posted impressive projects on GitHub. Your teaching methods are working. He smiled, typing back, their success is their own. We just opened the door. Her response came quickly, humble looks good on you, Alexander. See you tomorrow? The MIT campus was beautiful in the autumn morning light as Alexander walked to the committee meeting. He'd chosen a simple charcoal suit instead of his usual designer wear, carrying his own presentation materials rather than having an assistant handle them. These changes weren't for show anymore, they were simply who he was becoming. Rebecca was waiting outside the conference room reviewing some papers. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment, he caught an unguarded smile before her professional mask slipped back into place. You're early again? I had a good reason to be, he replied, then quickly added, the students' futures are worth being punctual for. The committee meeting room was smaller than he'd expected, more focused on functionality than impression. As Alexander set up his presentation, he noticed Rebecca taking a seat near the back, her notebook ready. The sight reminded him of all those late nights in the IT department, when she challenged him to think deeper, work harder, be better. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I'm not here to sell you on Pierce Technologies or myself. I'm here to discuss how we can work together to address a critical gap in technology education. As he walked the committee through the curriculum details, he could feel Rebecca's attention from the back of the room. But unlike before when he'd always been performing for an audience, he stayed focused on the substance of his presentation. He shared real data, admitted to challenges they'd faced, and emphasized the students' achievements over any corporate success metrics. During the Q&A session, one committee member asked pointedly, "Mr. Pierce, your company has a history of prioritizing image over substance. Why should we believe this initiative is different?" Before he could respond, Rebecca's voice came from the back of the room. "If I may?" At the committee chair's nod, she continued, "I've reviewed the program's methodology and results extensively. This isn't a corporate PR project. It's a carefully designed educational framework that's showing measurable impact. The fact that it isn't being publicized for marketing purposes actually speaks to its authenticity." Alexander felt warmth spread through his chest at her defense, but kept his expression professionally neutral. "Dr. Winters is correct," he said. "We're not here to build Pierce Technologies' image. We're here because every student who lacks access to technical education represents untapped potential for innovation and progress." After the meeting, as the committee members filed out discussing collaboration possibilities, Rebecca approached his laptop station. "That was well done," she said quietly. "Especially your handling of the challenges question. You've learned to be honest about difficulties without becoming defensive. I had an excellent role model in authentic leadership," he replied, gathering his materials. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then said, "Some of us are getting coffee to discuss next steps. Would you like to join?" "Purely professional, of course." "Of course," Alexander agreed, his heart lifting. "Though I should warn you, I've learned enough about proper coding practices to have strong opinions about programming languages now." A real smile touched her lips. "Careful, Mr. Pierce. Technical debates over coffee can be dangerous territory. I'll take my chances," he said softly. "Some things are worth the risk." As they walked together toward the campus coffee shop, maintaining a professional distance but sharing comfortable silence, Alexander realized something important. He was no longer trying to win back what they'd had before. That relationship had been built on false premises and hidden agendas. This new connection, growing slowly through shared purpose and genuine respect, was something much more real. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories/videos we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. The campus coffee shop buzzed with academic energy, students hunched over laptops, professors marking papers, and in their corner, a group of technology experts debating the future of education. Alexander found himself thoroughly engaged in a discussion about making advanced security concepts accessible to younger students, watching as Rebecca seamlessly led the conversation while including everyone's perspectives. "The key is making it relevant to their lives," one professor was saying. "Abstract concepts don't stick unless students can see real-world applications. That's why our program starts with personal device security," Alexander contributed. "Teaching them to protect their own digital lives first creates investment in the broader concepts." "Exactly," Rebecca agreed, then caught herself looking at him with approval. She quickly turned back to her notes. The challenge is scaling this approach without losing the hands-on mentorship component. As the discussion continued, Alexander noticed how different this felt from his old business meetings. There were no hidden agendas, no power plays, just passionate people trying to solve important problems. He found himself sharing stories about the students' successes and challenges, learning from others' experiences, and actually enjoying the collaborative environment. When the other professors began leaving for their afternoon commitments, Rebecca lingered, organizing her papers with deliberate precision. Alexander started gathering his own materials, trying not to rush. "Your students' projects," she said suddenly. "The ones I mentioned seeing on GitHub. Would you be willing to share their methodology? It might help us structure similar programs here." "Of course," he replied. "Though you might find some familiar elements. We based a lot of our teaching approach on how you trained your team at Pierce Technologies." She looked up, surprised. "You did? The way you broke down complex concepts, encouraged experimentation while maintaining security protocols, celebrated innovative thinking?" He shrugged slightly. "It was a proven successful model. I just adapted it for a younger audience." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, stirring her cooling coffee. "You know, when you first started coming to the IT department, I thought you were just..." She trailed off. "Slumming it?" he suggested with a self-deprecating smile. Playing at being technical? Something like that, she admitted. But you actually paid attention. Really learned. Not just the surface details but the underlying principles. I had a lot to relearn, Alexander said quietly. About technology, about leadership, about what really matters. He hesitated, then added, about how hollow success feels when it's built on image instead of substance. Their eyes met briefly and something shifted in the air between them. Rebecca adjusted her glasses, a gesture he now recognized as her processing something unexpected. The student's methodology documentation is on my laptop, he said, breaking the moment before it became too heavy. I can send it to you this evening? That would be helpful, she replied, professional tone back in place. But as she stood to leave, she added, you should come to next week's student symposium. Some of the MIT undergrads are doing interesting work in quantum encryption. Very similar to what Sarah was developing before I left Pierce Technologies. I'd like that, Alexander said carefully. If you think it would be valuable for the education initiative? It would be, Rebecca confirmed. Then, almost as an afterthought, and you might actually enjoy it. You always did light up around innovative code. As she walked away, Alexander remained at the table, looking down at his coffee cup. His phone buzzed, probably his assistant reminding him about board meetings and corporate obligations back in New York. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about his next business move or public appearance. Instead, he was thinking about the way Rebecca's eyes had softened when she talked about teaching, about how her passion for the work still inspired him to be better, about how their shared commitment to making a difference felt more real than any of his previous achievements. He was thinking about quantum encryption and student symposiums and all the meaningful work still to be done. And he was thinking that maybe, just maybe, the slow rebuild of trust through shared purpose was worth more than all the grand gestures in the world. Because this time they were building something real, one coffee shop discussion at a time. The MIT Student Symposium was exactly the kind of event Alexander would have skipped in his previous life. No press, no glamour, just rows of eager students presenting their research projects. Yet as he moved from presentation to presentation, he found himself more engaged than he'd ever been at any high-profile tech conference. Rebecca was in her element, asking thoughtful questions that helped students refine their ideas further. She had a gift for finding the potential in rough concepts, for seeing where nascent innovations could lead. Alexander watched her mentor a nervous freshman through a complex explanation of machine learning applications, and remembered how she'd done the same for him during those late nights in the IT department. This project reminds me of Sarah's work, Rebecca said as they examined a quantum encryption display. Have you been mentoring her further? She's actually leading her own team now, Alexander replied proudly. She's implemented several of your security protocols, with some impressive modifications. I think she's surpassed me technically. That's the goal of good teaching, Rebecca said softly. To have your students exceed you. She paused, then added, you've become a good teacher yourself, you know? I've seen how you interact with the students in your program. Before Alexander could respond, a young woman approached their booth, clutching a laptop. Dr. Winters? Mr. Pierce? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm working on combining quantum encryption with blockchain technology for medical record security, and I'm stuck on this implementation problem. They spent the next hour working through the students' code together, their old rhythm returning naturally. Alexander would suggest a technical approach, Rebecca would identify potential security vulnerabilities, and they'd build on each other's insights until they found a solution. The student watched them with growing excitement as her project evolved far beyond her original concept. You two work really well together, the student observed innocently. Are you collaborating on other projects? Alexander felt Rebecca tense slightly beside him, but her voice remained professional. Mr. Pierce and I have worked together previously. We're currently exploring potential collaboration between MIT's programs and his education initiative. Speaking of which, Alexander added smoothly, have you considered applying for our summer internship program? With your interest in medical security, you might be a good fit for our healthcare division. As the student hurried off with application information, Rebecca gave him an unreadable look. Healthcare division? That's new. We're expanding into medical security systems, Alexander explained. After seeing how vulnerable hospital networks were during the pandemic, it seemed like a natural evolution of our mission. Making technology work for people who need it most? That's actually important work, Rebecca said, sounding slightly surprised despite herself. I learned from someone that real innovation comes from solving real problems, not chasing market trends. He met her eyes briefly. Some lessons stick with you. They continued through the symposium, providing feedback and encouragement to students. As the event wound down, they found themselves in a quiet corner, watching the students pack up their projects. Do you miss it? Alexander asked suddenly. Pierce Technologies? The team? Rebecca was quiet for a moment. I miss certain aspects, she admitted. The late-night debugging sessions. Watching junior developers grow. The feeling that we were building something meaningful. She adjusted her glasses. But I'm doing important work here too. You are, Alexander agreed. These students are lucky to have you. He hesitated, then added, we all were. She turned to look at him directly. Why did you really come to the symposium, Alexander? It's not exactly the kind of event that demands CEO attendance. Because you were right, he said simply. About everything. About what matters, about the work that needs to be done, about the responsibility we have to nurture new talent. He gestured at the departing students. These kids don't care about my net worth or magazine covers. They care about building something meaningful. Just like you taught me to care about it again. Rebecca's expression softened almost imperceptibly. The MIT committee is meeting tomorrow about the collaboration proposal. They're impressed with the sincerity of your program. And you? Alexander asked quietly. Are you convinced it's sincere? She gathered her papers slowly. I'm convinced you're not the same person who used to treat my department as his personal social experiment. She met his eyes. That's a start. As they walked toward the parking lot, a cool evening breeze stirring fallen leaves around their feet, Alexander realized something. He wasn't trying to get back what they'd lost anymore. That relationship had been built on his superficial games and her unwitting participation. This new connection, growing slowly through shared purpose and genuine respect, was something much more valuable. Even if it never became more than professional collaboration, it was real. And real, he'd finally learned, was worth more than all the perfect appearances in the world. The MIT committee's decision came through the next morning. Unanimous approval for collaboration between Pierce Technologies' Education Initiative and MIT's outreach programs. Alexander received the news via a formal email, but it was the second message in his inbox that made his heart race, a note from Rebecca. The committee was particularly impressed by your commitment to maintaining program integrity over publicity. They've asked me to serve as primary liaison for the collaboration, given my familiarity with both organizations. If you're amenable, we should discuss implementation strategy. My office, 3 p.m.? The familiar corridors of MIT's computer science building felt different now, filled with purpose rather than tension. Alexander found Rebecca's office easily. It was exactly what he'd expected, walls lined with technical books and whiteboards covered in complex algorithms. She was focused on her computer screen, that familiar concentrated expression on her face. Come in, she said without looking up. I'm just finishing the framework for our first joint workshop. She gestured to a chair, still typing. Your Sarah sent over some interesting suggestions for the curriculum integration. She's not my Sarah, Alexander corrected gently, taking a seat. She's her own brilliant self. I just try to provide the resources she needs to grow. That made Rebecca look up, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. You really have learned about nurturing talent instead of trying to own it? I had an excellent teacher, he replied. Then, keeping his tone professional, what are your thoughts on the implementation timeline? They spent the next 2 hours mapping out the collaboration structure, their old working rhythm returning naturally. Rebecca would point out potential challenges, Alexander would suggest resource solutions, and together they'd build something better than either could have created alone. We should pilot this at the Bronx location, Rebecca said, scanning their notes. The student population there is already showing strong results, and... She trailed off, noticing Alexander's expression. What? Nothing, he said quickly. It's just, you've been tracking their progress? She adjusted her glasses, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. I follow all significant developments in tech education, professionally speaking. Of course, Alexander agreed, fighting a smile. Purely professional interest. Rebecca gave him a look that was half exasperation, half amusement. Don't get smug, Mr. Pierce. I also track developments at Google, Apple, and several other tech companies. But you're not implementing collaborative programs with them, he pointed out softly. The moment hung between them, weighted with unspoken meanings. Finally, Rebecca stood, gathering her papers with precise movements. Because their programs lack substance, she said carefully. They're more interested in publicity than actual impact. And mine? Alexander asked quietly. She paused, really looking at him. Yours has evolved into something genuine. Something worthy of support? She hesitated, then added, much like its founder. Before he could respond, her office phone rang, another professor with questions about the quantum computing lab. As she took the call, Alexander gathered his things, moving quietly toward the door. But Rebecca held up a finger, signaling him to wait. The workshop planning, she said after hanging up. We should continue it tomorrow. Over lunch, maybe? The cafeteria has surprisingly decent sandwiches. She spoke matter-of-factly, but her fingers were fidgeting with her pen. Purely for efficiency's sake, of course. Of course, Alexander agreed, keeping his voice steady despite the warmth spreading through his chest. Purely professional. As he walked back to his hotel through the crisp autumn evening, Alexander reflected on how different this felt from their early interactions. Back then he'd been playing a game, trying to prove something to himself and others. Now, every small step forward felt earned, every shared moment genuine. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Board wants to know when you're coming back to NYC. Apparently, some people find it odd that the CEO is spending so much time at MIT. Alexander typed back, working on something important. Something real. Because that's what this was, real work, real progress, real connection built on shared values and mutual respect. And if that connection was growing into something more, it was happening naturally, without manipulation or hidden agendas. Just two people discovering that their paths aligned more truly than they'd ever expected. The MIT cafeteria was crowded with students when Alexander arrived the next day, the air filled with animated discussions about quantum physics and artificial intelligence. He spotted Rebecca at a corner table, already spreading out curriculum documents while eating a sandwich. The sight was so familiar, so reminiscent of their working lunches in the IT department, that he felt a sudden ache of nostalgia. I got you turkey on whole wheat, she said without looking up as he approached. You still avoid white bread, right? The fact that she remembered such a small detail made him pause. You didn't have to. It was efficient, she said quickly. More time for work. But there was a slight color in her cheeks that suggested otherwise. They fell into reviewing the workshop plans, their conversation flowing naturally between technical details and broader educational philosophy. Rebecca's passion for teaching shone through as she outlined her vision for making advanced concepts accessible to younger students. The key is building confidence early, she was saying, gesturing with half her sandwich forgotten in her hand. Once they believe they can understand complex systems, there's no limit to what they can learn. Like that junior developer you helped last year, Alexander remembered. The one who thought she couldn't handle the security protocols until you broke them down for her. Rebecca looked surprised. You remember that? I remember everything about those days, he said quietly. Then, keeping his tone professional, it taught me a lot about effective leadership. She studied him for a moment. You really have changed how you lead. I've been reading the industry reports. Pierce Technologies' developer retention rate is up 60%. Your teams are producing innovative solutions instead of just chasing market trends. We're finally doing what we should have been doing all along, Alexander replied. Creating real value instead of just managing perceptions. He hesitated, then added, though I still struggle sometimes with the technical details. I find myself wondering what you would suggest. You can ask, Rebecca said softly. Professionally speaking, I'm happy to consult on technical matters. Their eyes met, and for a moment the crowded cafeteria seemed to fade away. Then a group of students dropped their trays at the next table, breaking the spell. Rebecca turned back to her documents, but her voice was gentler when she spoke again. The quantum encryption module you're developing for the high school program. It's good. Really good. You've taken complex principles and made them understandable without oversimplifying. I had an excellent model to work from, Alexander said. Someone who taught me that real teaching is about empowering others, not showing off your own knowledge. She glanced up at him over her glasses. You're not just talking about teaching methods anymore, are you? No, he admitted. I'm not. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, organizing her papers with precise movements. Finally, she said, there's a tech education conference in Boston next month. The committee thinks we should present our collaboration model. I'll have my assistant clear my schedule, Alexander replied immediately. It's not a glamorous event, she warned. No press, no red carpet. Just educators and developers trying to make a difference. Sounds perfect, he said sincerely. Those are exactly the people we need to reach. She nodded slowly. The conference runs for 3 days. We'll need to prepare our presentation thoroughly. Maybe we could. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Have dinner? To discuss the approach. Purely professional, of course. Of course, Alexander agreed, his heart beating faster despite his calm exterior. Though perhaps not in the cafeteria this time? There's a small Italian place near campus, Rebecca suggested, still not meeting his eyes. Good food, quiet atmosphere. Suitable for professional discussion. As they gathered their things to head back to their respective meetings, Alexander noticed Rebecca had barely touched her lunch, too caught up in their planning session. It reminded him of all those times she'd forgotten to eat while solving complex problems in the IT department. "Rebecca," he said as she turned to leave. "Thank you. Not just for the collaboration but for giving me the chance to prove that change is possible."